So welcome everybody and welcome to Paul Dickinson in this podcast and part of our series Leading in a Climate Changed World. It's a great joy to talk with you, Paul. I've known you for many, many years, and for those of you who don't know Paul Dickinson, he founded CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, in the year 2000, with a vision to help the global economic system operate within sustainable environmental boundaries and to prevent dangerous climate change. CDP manages a data platform that gathers data on greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, the drivers of deforestation from major corporations, cities, states, and regions around the world. It's seen really as the gold standard, I would say, of data collection. And the data reported through CDP is used by a global network of investors and purchasers, representing over $90 trillion, which is actually more than the GDP of the world. So a very significant player. Doing very, very useful work for many years. And you've been the visionary founder and now the executive chair of CDP. So it's a great pleasure to spend some time with you.
Pleasure's all mine, Robin.
Maybe we could start with just a sense from you about where are we with climate change? Different scientists seem to say different things. Some people say it's already too late and we're now managing decline. Some people say we have 10 to 12 years. Some people say we have 2 to 4 years. What is your sense about what the data is actually telling us?
Well, I think what's extremely interesting about climate change, if you just think of it in the nature of the problem, it's a major global problem that's very likely to have significant impact probably over the next, I'm going to say, 200 to 300 years. So we're in a completely unprecedented type of problem. We've never really had a problem like this to talk about before, and it manifests itself in lots of different ways in lots of different countries. So I think our language is actually a bit lacking. So in a sense, in answer to your question, you put forward various propositions like, is it too late or have we got 2 years or 12 years? Actually, all of these different things can be true in different ways. Long story short, it's an enormous problem. It's not as bad as something like full-scale nuclear war, which probably would kill all humans in a year or two. It's just a very serious problem, and one that we really need to address. But I mean, I could probably give you more granularity on some of the specifics.
So when you say, yeah, I think it would be useful maybe to look a little bit at that, because a lot of the conversation is about the timeline, and I wonder in CDP and in your own life, how you face this question of the timeline. And also how we work with a sense of urgency and at the same time have the relaxed spaciousness we need to innovate.
Yeah, that's a super well put question, Roman, because I think in a sense, that's a lot of the heart of climate change. And I mean, the first thing I would say is that people find climate change extremely difficult to cope with at a personal level. I suppose I did actually when I first kind of came across it, because you're really presented with three options. Either you completely change your life and sort of stop flying around the place and eating beef and all the rest of it, or you live with horrible contradictions, or you deny it's a problem. Those are the three. And I think probably the environmental community, to some regard, have not done a very good job of helping people manage those three choices and deal with the contradictions. I remember I spoke to someone I very much admire about climate change, and I said, in a sense, our work in this generation is the first act of a sort of 4-act play. And I remember she said to me, yeah, and act 2 ain't going to be pretty. So there's definitely trouble present now in the world in terms of extreme weather. There's a lot more coming. But humans are very clever. We have fantastic technology, and we're really capable of organizing ourselves. I was quite impressed recently with the inspiring US Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she's put forward this Green New Deal, and she makes the metaphor with World War II. She says it's a World War II situation. And I actually, when I got into climate change, I studied World War II a bit and Churchill's sort of inspiring speeches and stuff. But for example, the charity I've been working on is a relatively new climate change charity, and we're 19 years old. World War II was 4.5, 5 years all in. So in a sense, we've got a global crisis, but it is a multi-decadal crisis. And that's what's so new about it. We have to, in a sense, find a way to combine urgency with with continuity. And certainly, as we say in this organization to colleagues, it's a marathon and not a sprint.
Right, and I noticed that you're studiously avoiding, maybe very wisely, trying to put a figure around how many years we have to do that within.
Yeah, well, let me give you a very personal response to that, which is not the one of my organization. Having had basically a couple of decades to dwell on this, I would say really absolutely nobody knows. What we have done is, and the reason why people will talk about 12 years or something like that, is there's been a political definition of our goal, which is staying below 2 degrees centigrade. And this is quite important because the original 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change said the world must avoid dangerous climate change, but it never defined what dangerous was. So there was a sort of loosey-goosey character to that. But I think it was in 2009 or 2010, governments agreed we must stay below 2 degrees. And that then helped the scientific community, particularly the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a kind of, it is what it says it is, scientists from different governments. They came up with a budget to keep us below 2 degrees. And then if you think of a carbon budget, how much more carbon, greenhouse gases we can emit, you can then sort of say, well, how would we have to reduce to sort of avoid going over 2 degrees? And that's where this 10 to 12 years comes from. And I think probably, because I'm not a scientist, I would say that they're probably pretty much approximately right. But the Earth system is highly complex, and therefore things could be slightly better than we thought. They could be a lot worse than we thought. And that's actually where we get into the sort of realm of insurance. That is to say that one of the reasons why I think insurance experts will tell you we should take climate change very, very seriously is not so much because we have certainty of the risk, but actually because we have uncertainty, that's much more reason to take it seriously.
Right, thank you. And maybe we could talk a little bit then about, you said at the very beginning, we can all get engaged with this. Like, who really has the power to make a difference? I know you work at corporate levels. I also know you work a lot with citizens empowerment and shareholders. And do we all have power, or where are the levers of power to make a difference at this time?
I was doing a little bit of kind of academic study and go back a long time. I think it was maybe John Locke talked about the Leviathan, the idea of a state, traditionally in the form of the sovereign, the king, queen, or Caesar or someone. The forces of a nation combined through a sort of super citizen who maintains the rule of law and critically is responsible for protecting us. I think that's been the political model really since we had politics. It's evolved into more complex notions like democratic states. But what I think is absolutely critical about the 21st century is the rise of the corporation essentially as a political unit. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. There's a rather good blog from the World Bank that points out that of the 100 largest economies in the world, if you measure them by government income, only 33 are countries, 67 are corporations. And actually, corporations are really the dominant actors. The thing about corporations are, on the one hand, the board of directors would seem to have a lot of power. They could put a $5 billion factory here or a $5 billion factory somewhere else. That's a lot of power. But if they're, for example, a car company, they just sort of make cars, and it's quite hard for the board of directors to say, oh, we should do something very different. I mean, perhaps they could make electric cars, but their room for maneuver is somewhat limited. If the board of directors thought that this car company should actually just plant trees in an emergency measure to mitigate climate change and spend all the money the company had, probably the shareholders would get rid of them. So you've got to ask yourself who's really got the power. And I think that the short story is that power is highly diffuse in the 21st century. And I mean, there's one story, for example, which I'm not entirely sure how accurate this is, but Toyota is a big, well-run car company. And because of that, they produced a wonderful hybrid car called the Prius. Now, I have been told anecdotally that certain senior figures in Toyota didn't take the Prius very seriously. But Leonardo DiCaprio, the Hollywood movie actor, got concerned about climate change, and he bought a Prius, and then many other Hollywood stars bought a Prius. It has that wonderful thing that sort of tells you about energy on the dashboard, and it's almost like the car where the driver sells it to passengers. Anyway, it became the third best-selling car in the whole world. And what I think is it's a subtle combination of a good company producing a good product, being picked up by influence makers, it having certain marketing features in it, and kind of catching the zeitgeist. So in a sense, I think power is perhaps best revealed in those sorts of processes.
Yeah, and that in a way leads us into a question about leadership. As you know, this series of podcasts is about leading in a climate change world. So maybe you could talk a bit about what would characterize the type of leadership, be it corporate, be it political, be it community, civic, like what kind of leadership do you think we need? And also maybe you could surface a few examples of what you have experienced as great leadership at this time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're a real expert on leadership, Robin. So I feel a little bit, like I'll do my best. One form of leadership, and this is a very simple example. Well, there's an old definition, sort of joke about leadership. Leadership involves working out where everyone's going to go, running there in advance and shouting over here. And of course, one of the things that allows you to do is to get there a little bit quicker. I've been very struck recently after seeing huge waves of industrial activity around renewable energy, and then huge waves of industrial activity around electric vehicles. I'm now seeing a huge wave of industrial activity in terms of food and future food. And there are companies, Impossible Foods is one, they make a plant burger, which is storming London. There's a burger chain called the Honest Burger Company, and I've spoken to a couple of the managers there. The plant burger is selling, 20 to 25% of their burgers are now this plant burger. They've redefined, so to say, vegan food as better than meat. So meat eaters like me, to be honest with you, go and buy the plant burger because we prefer it to meat. Now, the food scientists who got together and could see that it was worth investing millions, perhaps tens of millions of dollars or euro or whatever, in developing the taste that would really be able to take on meat. I would call that a kind of technological leadership or an entrepreneurial leadership. And billions of dollars are going into these food companies. Within existing companies, I think that leadership is sometimes a bit harder to find. But for example, there's a rather wonderful company called Schneider Electric, turns over about 24 billion euro a year, a big company. And I had the privilege to meet the chief executive about 9-10 years ago, and he just said, "I bet the company on climate change." Everything we do is going to be climate change related, and Schneider Electric essentially sells energy efficiency, renewable energy, and so on. There's big companies like Acciona have decided we're going to just be the premier wind and solar energy developer in the world. These companies are doing extremely well. Ørsted has redefined itself entirely as a renewables company. So I would say those are examples of corporate leadership in existing business where you really just reposition the whole company and say, look, I can see the future, and we're gonna own this.
And one of the arguments that sometimes comes against that is from people saying, but we can't do the right thing. Like sometimes I've heard it said in business, we can't do the ethical thing and the right thing because it won't maximize our profits. We have a legal obligation to our shareholders to maximize our profits, even in the short term, the next quarter, the quarter after that. So how does this kind of leadership take account of its fiduciary responsibility to maximize profits in the short term?
And that's a great question. And I wouldn't say fiduciary responsibility is to maximize profits in the short term. I'd say it's to maximize profits. just to make that distinction, because very often you are looking at capital investment. So I have toyed with the idea if I ever wanted to escape the sort of poverty that prevails in a job like mine. I get paid a reasonable salary, but if I wanted more money and I went to a corporation, I would, if I was senior enough, I would want to go to the shareholders first and say, look, friends, we've got a plan here. We're going to reposition the business from A to B. We're going to have to invest a lot, and you're going to see possibly increased capital expenditure in 2019 through to 2021. But I think we believe you're going to see stellar profits from 2022 to 2025. that's the investment case. The other part of your question is how do you know it's going to work? And the key here is I want to go back to one of the very first principles of business. I heard a definition once of marketing, which was giving people what they want. Now, you'll hear a lot of people say, oh, people won't pay any more for green. And I think, why would you pay any more for green? It sounds like a stupid idea. But people certainly pay more for Gucci or for Bentley. People will pay more for things that they want. People will go to fine restaurants. People wear fine clothes. People are very happy to spend more if they want to. And that's the thing. In a sense, having spent about 10 years in corporate communications, corporate marketing, I concluded that, well, it's a rather clumsy title, but sustainability product marketing is the absolute key. So it could be, for example, that your electric vehicle is actually less expensive than a petrol vehicle. And it's really worth looking at the energy costs of powering an electric vehicle against a petrol vehicle. So you may well be able to sell electric vehicles saying it will save you money. But perhaps, because there's a lot of discretion, and I'm just going to carry on with the car analogy, perhaps there's a discretion to say, well, we're Tesla, we're going to sell you a fantastic car and it's going to cost more than a normal car, but you want that, don't you, Robin? So it's essentially, it's a part of business that's often overlooked in discussions about sustainability, is getting the business case from the customer to deliver what they want, even though it might be a premium product.
That's great. And I know that you've also done a lot of work, excuse me, with shareholders and getting shareholders to ask the right questions and put together coalitions of forward resolutions about disclosure and other things. Maybe you could tell us one or two kind of case studies around how shareholder activism has started to really impact on the deliverables for the corporates.
Yeah, well, I think a really good example of that is probably around coal. Coal is typically burnt to produce electricity all over the world, a lot of coal. And companies involved in those processes, may have concerns about climate change, but they just kind of think, well, customers want to buy our electricity, so we're just going to buy more coal. The financial community are able to have what a co-founder of CDP, Tessa Tennant, used to call a bird's eye view over the whole economy. So they can sit there, a pension fund or a big fund manager can sit there and say, there may be coal being burned here and there, but collectively, burning coal because it produces the most greenhouse gas emissions of any fossil fuel has kind of got to stop. So there have been a number of shareholder resolutions against major coal manufacturers saying, get out of coal. And there have been numerous efforts by shareholders to persuade banks to stop financing coal. And essentially, coal has become very hard to finance now. And an atmosphere has been created by shareholders such that coal just doesn't make business sense anymore. And it is declining substantially as an industry. Something similar has been happening with unconventional oil recovery, the so-called tar sands, where you have to use a very large amount of energy to boil up kind of sludge and turn it into kind of oil. Again, these sorts of operations have been receiving negative press from shareholders, and I'm going to call it at an aggregate level, a communication from shareholders saying to management of companies, you've got to stop doing this. And actually, the penny's dropped.
That's good to hear. And I'm also now starting to think about where we need to put our focus, because I know that in the history of CDP, for example, you've moved from focusing on carbon, and then you've included water and forests. And this isn't a CDP related question, but more generally, like where are the next frontiers that we also need to address? And what's the leadership that's going to take us there?
Well, and I do know CDP well, Robin, because you've been kind of consulting to us and facilitating us for a decade or more. But you'll also know I organize events sometimes at Fintorn, and my friend Nick Robbins, who's a very distinguished climate change economist, I suppose, and he conducted the UNEP inquiry on a sustainable financial system. He was former head of climate change at HSBC. He's recently taken a position as a professor at the London School of Economics, studying what he's calling the just transition. And I think I hope he'll forgive me speaking for him, but what I believe he's most interested in is the risk we face, that if responding to climate change is associated with unemployment, Donald Trump did extremely well in the 2016 election by putting on a kind of hat, like a miner's hat, and saying, Trump digs coal. There were lots of banners saying Trump digs coal. And of course, the Democrats, Trump's opponents, have been very much associated with kind of shutting down the coal industry. So the frontier that I think Nick is pioneering, this just transition, is to say, look, there are industries like coal where, essentially we probably have to stop producing coal. But that doesn't mean that if you're a coal miner, your brothers and sisters in society just wanted to kind of put you on the scrap heap and let you fend for yourself through poverty and particularly because coal mines are quite they're located. The workers are located in these towns. If there wasn't a coal mine, why is the town there? And so I think that the social issues, wealth inequalities, to be honest with you, and their impact on our politics have become increasingly an important part of climate change. It seems like they're totally separate things, but oddly enough, if to give you an extreme example, the Paris Agreement of 2015, which is critical for us on climate change, was to a degree created by the United States, who used their enormous international power to help achieve it. Then the United States themselves pulled out of the agreement they created, in part because the new president was put there by nervous coal miners. So you can see how these social elements actually become critical to the international efforts.
Right. So, yeah, just thinking where we want to go now. We could go in lots of different directions, I think, with this. So we want to broaden into justice and the just transition. I'm also wondering whether climate change is really still seen as a bit of a niche, or whether it's really, your sense is that it's becoming mainstream. I was working for a energy company recently, and they were, the CEOs had a vision to transition to sustainable energy systems. But a lot of this is a huge multinational company, but a lot of the people that we were working with are saying, yeah, but I'm running a coal generating, coal-fired station over here, and we're doing gas over here, and this is where the profits are, and advising people on how to reduce their energy usage, also to produce their own, which is part of what this company is going to start to do, providing services and not energy directly, isn't going to make us the money. So there's this kind of gulf between the leadership saying this is where we're going to go, and people saying, well, we're just going to carry on business as usual for as long as we can get away with it. And I wonder what your sense is about whether climate change is still, in a way, a niche obsession with people who care about it, or whether it's in the mainstream. And again, relating that to leadership, maybe you have some examples of places where it started to become part of the DNA, not just at the leadership level, but it's rippling through the kind of largest corporations or the largest cities or the largest entities that you engage with.
Well, no, that's a great question, and it's a very difficult question. I think one of the advantages, it's a huge privilege for me to work full-time on climate change for 19 years. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to see just the public debate go from sort of 0 to what feels like 100 miles an hour. In each year, another 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour. I remember when I started doing this work in the Financial Times, it would say, greenhouse gas emissions or CO2, which some people say is linked to the idea of human-induced climate change. Now I see on the front page of my newspaper all the time, senior politicians, business people saying climate change is #1 problem, we've got to act, So there's definitely, there are sort of ups and downs, but the trend is more and more interest in climate change. There's no doubt in my mind. I mentioned one of 2 new leaders a moment ago, which was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 28-year-old US Congresswoman. But I'd also particularly like to draw your attention to the 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, who in 6 months has gone from complete obscurity to having 4.5 million references to her on Google. And she is, I was describing to a friend of mine how we've been waiting for the alarm clock to go off for decades. And it's actually gone off in the kid's bedroom, but it's woken the whole house up, right? And, it's the stupidest thing, but it's actually true. people who are 16 have got much more at stake in this than someone our age. And I think that that's important because there's a kind of crazy dysfunction where on the one hand, parents lavish attention on their children and nothing's too good for my child, right? But then on the other hand, they just don't think about climate change and deliver actually their children into a very sinister environment potentially. So I think people like Greta are really fundamentally changing things far more than we might realize. Now, in terms of organizations that have really taken this on 100%, I think there's perhaps two ways an organization can take things on. One is at a kind of like operational day-to-day level. And, I can think of many great companies where, climate change is built into a L'Oreal, for example, the cosmetics manufacturer. They take climate change extremely seriously. They perform very well in our evaluations. I mean, some people will say, well, it's easy for them because they're not making steel or cement, but there's significant amounts of energy and materials involved in L'Oreal production. And so I can see a company like that really taking on climate change at sort of every level within their existing activity. But I think what's interesting about a company like Ørsted is it said, well, or indeed your client that you mentioned is here a company saying we're actually fundamentally changing our strategy. Like L'Oreal is still basically going to make cosmetics and other products, whereas some companies say, well, actually, we're really part of the problem with our current mix of products, and we're moving to the solution. And perhaps one of the really good examples that sits between the two is also Unilever, which has really taken on the mantle of saying, well, we're going to do both. We're going to kind of reduce environmental impact from our products and services, but we're also going to redesign our products. And that's probably the key. It's actually doing everything you can about your existing products and then having a product map that will take you to a sustainable future. So I think, those are companies that spring to mind and are very widely regarded. And just one thing that I think is super interesting and worth noting is that a couple of years ago, Unilever became the subject of a hostile takeover bid from Kraft Foods and this Brazilian conglomerate, which I think is called 3G. And their plan was to kind of cost strip Unilever and increase profits, which I'm sure they would have done for a year or two. But actually, since this failed takeover bid, Kraft shares have kind of plummeted and Unilever shares have done really very, very well. And what that tells me is that, yes, you have to kind of invest in sustainability and redesigning your company. But if you take your citizen customers with you, that's a great thing. Just a little bit of framing before I forget. People will say, well, who's running the world? Is it the governments or is it the board of directors of the companies? I'm actually going to suggest that the sovereign in the whole system is the citizen. And the citizen, she or he, votes in two ways. When they buy things, they're voting with their money. And when they invest, they're voting with their money. And those two votes there can actually change the direction of the whole thing. And that's how you kind of close it out, is if you take them with you in your journey, then it's good for them, it's good for you, it's good for the planet.
Great, and I think that's a great way to close, actually, because it gives us all a sense of being empowered as citizens, that we can vote when we buy, we vote when we invest, we can make a difference to the system as a whole. So unless there's anything else you want to add as a little coda, I think we've had a great half an hour, and I really want to thank you for your time and your expertise and for your passion and your commitment to the cause. You've been working, as you say, for decades on this issue, well before it was fashionable. And thank you for that. And thank you for your time today. Anything you want to say by way of closing, Paul?
Be brave, because it's time for bravery. And that bravery will be rewarded. And just to say thank you so much, Robin, for the time.
Yeah, thanks again, Paul. Bye for now.